Evaluating the effectiveness of group equivalence-based instruction using observational learning. So there's an abundance of research that has to do with our field in early intensive behavioral intervention and discrete trial training. These terms are probably the most widely researched ones in our field. And equivalence-based instruction has kind of come from this. There are a lot of studies on EBI here recently, but the technology isn't necessarily a new technology. It was demonstrated in the 1970s by the famous Murray Sidman study, where he taught adults with developmental disabilities how to read. However, current studies, not a whole lot of them have dealt with studies evaluating group-based EBI. What studies have been done have used an embedded observational learning component. But what these studies have kind of revealed early on is that there's some limitations when using these types of EBI procedures with individuals with developmental disabilities. So for instance, Ramirez et al. 2009 and Rayfelt et al. 2003, we're going to talk about a few of their limitations here in just a minute. So in the current study, we wanted to use a program out of the PEAK-E module using group equivalence-based instruction as the design. We wanted to use, just like some of the earlier studies, to embed an observational learning component and utilize, like I said, the two studies that I mentioned earlier. Two of the big findings from those studies were that there needs to be an observation response. So when you're delivering a task demand to a learner and you have another participant who serves as the observer, you want to make sure that upon answering the task demand for one participant, that second participant is also engaged and watching as the learner responds and is given instructive feedback, or else observational learning can't take place. So some of the examples used in previous literature involved, blowing a kiss to the sample stimuli presented, or touching, or like in the current study, we used a button that each of the participants would press before they would answer any of the task demands. And then a huge finding was also that if you use two individuals with developmental disabilities, you want to make sure you're teaching something within the same superordinate class. So for instance, if I teach one individual how to derive relations between, say, animals, I want to make sure that second participant is also being trained in that same class of animals. I don't want to give job occupations to one participant and animals to another because observational findings are just not as robust that way. So in this current study, we used two individuals, Tim and Nate, 12 and 11. They were both diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And our independent variable for this program was adapted from the PEAK equivalence module, the 10P metonymical tax. I basically used an arbitrary class for one of them instead of a metonymical tax. So the name of this was just cloud formations. The dependent variable was PEAK scores 0 or a 10 on each of the trial blocks. We used regular PEAK scoring sheets, but only scored them as 0 or a 10 for each trial. The way this went down was we had a baseline, an A to B training, a probe, a B to C training, and initially we were going to stop at the test for class formation. However, Nate did not exhibit derivation of his directly trained set, so we went ahead with 2 additional remedial training and remedial probe phases. And the prompting procedure was just basically, if they got it right, hey, good job, here's a piece of candy. Or we would repeat the SD and provide a gestural prompt. And then kind of like that second line of defense was we would repeat the SD and provide the full physical prompt, but it actually never got to that point with either of the participants. So here is stimulus class A. We had a stimulus class A, B, and C, and each were comprised of 8 different class members. I have them divided up here, where on the left you can see class members 1 through 4, and on the right you can see class members 5 through 8 for stimulus class A. On the left, this is what we trained Nate on, and on the right, this is what we trained Tim. So for instance, Nate was trained on 1 through 4, but he was also, he also got to see the stimulus class 5 through 8 as well, and that served as this observation set and vice versa for Tim. So this was stimulus class B, and all 8 members, again, divided in half, where 4 were given to Nate and 4 were given to Tim. Here was stimulus class C. These were our arbitrary symbols. And so baseline, probe, and the test for class formation were run identical to one another. During these phases, only one participant was present, and the 4 relations of A to B, B to C, A to C, and C to A were probed in a single trial block of 10. However, for A to B, we did a observation set and a train set. So A to B 1 through 4 was probed, and A to B 5 through 8 was probed. And we kept, it was the same, B to C, A to C, C to A for 1 through 4 and 5 through 8. We did this so we could keep the observation and the train set separate and kind of see how that observational learning component was coming along. So this basically meant that for every baseline, probe, and test for class formation, there were a total of 80 trials per participant. For A to B training, it was the picture of the cloud to the sight word for that cloud. And both participants had to be present in order for training to occur. And they rotated between roles as learner and observer. So obviously there's 10 trials per block. So it was an average of every 3 trials, but basically what it looked like was every 3, 3, and 4 trials, they would swap places. The script that we read to them was the same every time they would swap between the learner and observer. And it got really repetitive, but basically what the script was is I would say, hey, Tim, you're gonna watch and listen as Nate performs his task. Don't talk, point, or help him. It's Nate's turn right now. And eventually both my participants got really sick of me saying that over and over again. So yeah, they were not too happy with me for that methodological consideration. But we also used an observation response, which was pushing the battery operated button. I would present, so for this one, I would present the picture of the cloud formation. I would put the button next to it for the sample stimuli, and I would say, push the button, look at the cloud. Same thing for the other participant. And then I would deliver the SD to whoever was serving as the learner during that trial. B to C training, it didn't differ at all from A to B training, except that we used the sight word to the arbitrary symbol. So this occurred after the probe phase. Again, I said we went baseline, A to B, probe, and then B to C. So B to C training, like I said, exactly the same as A to B, except for using sight words and arbitrary symbols. So at this point in time, we had to make the decision to go ahead and conduct remedial training and probes for Nate because he wasn't showing derivation of the observed or the directly trained set. So we ran this pretty much the same, the same process as we did A to B and B to C training. However, A to B and B to C, we did 1 trial block of each and we ran them consecutively. So we did A to B and B to C for the train set and observation set. Both participants were present. And then as soon as we would run, basically it was 40 trials, 4 trial blocks, A to B 1 through 4, A to B 5 through 8, B to C 1 through 4, B to C 5 through 8. And then we would remove Tim from the room and we would conduct and probe only the A to C and C to A relations for both the observation and training sets. So as you can see during baseline, here in our results section, both participants scored fairly low in the baseline. We had to go ahead and probe Tim again just to be on the safe side. He scored a 60 on the C to A relation. However, when we probed him again, he scored a 40. So it kind of increased our confidence that they probably weren't exposed to any of these relations. So we went ahead with A to B training. As you can see, Tim, these 2 graphs are the directly trained set for each of the participants. So as you can see with Tim, he reached mastery on A to B and the B to C training at a greater pace than Nate, and actually both the direct train and the observation set. But mastery was defined as 90% or above across 3 consecutive sessions. So Nate's variability, especially in that B to C training phase, really kind of slowed down training. But something funky kind of happens here with Nick's data. So if you look at the top graph, A to B is expected during the probe. He scores a 90%, but then for the remaining untrained relations of B to C, A to C, and C to A, those scores probably should have been similar to what Nate scored. His scores were 50% and below because those were the last 3 untrained relations. So we go A to B training, and A to B is supposed to be high for the train set and observation set, However, Nate's showing a typical response to this, whereas Tim's scores are all fairly high. And then we move into the B2C training. Again, a lot of variability with Nate. Tim's scores are fairly consistent. He shows some variability, which shows maybe he didn't quite master that B2C as shown in the probe. And so maybe he actually didn't have that skill. He was just guessing correctly. And then you see the test for class formation. Tim scores at mastery on all of his relations of the directly trained set, and Nate only scores at mastery for the A to B and the B to C set. He doesn't show derivation of the A to C and C to A. At this point, we conducted, again, 2 remedial training and remedial probe sessions, and through those scores, Nate was able to show mastery of the C to A and the A to C probes eventually. On the C to A, he scores 90, and the A to C, he scores 100. And then moving on to the observation set, you can see again, baseline scores fairly low for all participants. And again, in the probe, so this is right after A to B training, Nate surprisingly shows that he is able to demonstrate this A to B relation of the observation set. So he was not directly trained. This was Tim's set, 5 through 8 of A to B, and he scores a 90%, but Tim only scores a 60%. So on this probe A to B, we were expecting a 90 to 100% mastery on that observation relation. But surprisingly, Nate hits it and Tim does not. So all of Tim's scores are pretty low during the probe. Then on the test for class formation, Tim's scores jump up to mastery on just about all of the relations, whereas Nate scores, even after remedial training, compared with baseline on the A to C and C to A probes, he scores 40 and 20 during baseline and manages to get up to 70 and 90% during remedial training. He still doesn't hit mastery, which is unfortunate. However, the trend in the data does suggest that maybe with further remedial training, this could have occurred. So overall, in a nutshell, Tim was effectively demonstrated what we thought would occur with both participants. Derivation of all the train sets did happen after remedial training for Tim and Nate. Unfortunately, even after further remedial training, Nate was just not able to get the derivation to mastery of the observation set. So while this suggests that maybe this type of instruction, this type of procedure can work in groups, or at least 2 participants at once, maybe this suggests that there is some utility in this design. Obviously, we got to interpret these results with caution because we need more research. It seems like the observational component of this is a little bit weaker than the directly trained component in EBI, especially group designs. So, who knows, what's further needed to kind of tweak this design to make it work in an applied setting. So some of the limitations and areas for growth and future research, scheduling conflicts and absences were really difficult with this procedure. We were working with students that were already receiving therapy, and some of their parents were pretty particular about what type of therapy they were getting. So we only got 30 minutes twice a week with each of these participants. And anytime there was an absence per week for one of the children, the whole week of training had to be scrapped because both participants had to be present. The observation response is not foolproof. Sometimes it was actually a hindrance because one of the participants just wanted to kind of watch me press this button with my eyes closed, or how hard I can hit the button. So maybe that needs to be tailored and individualized a little bit more in further research. And just overall, the experimental control of Tim's data. We just need a lot more research looking into this, with his data jumping around like it did in his train set on the remaining 3 untrained relations. It just kind of is worrisome with, how much experimental control is with this design. And then again, we only use 2 participants. So we need to see how many participants we can push this to in an applied setting. And then what happens when we use it with teachers and aides and, individuals that don't have experience running EEC or EBI procedures with this demographic.